Welcome to Hungry for Comfort, Chinese food, diversity, and delights. My name is Chris Theophilou-Giannakos, Museum Coordinator at Gibson House Museum. Gibson House Museum is pleased to co-host this annual food series event today. It is important that we take a moment to acknowledge the land we are meeting on is a territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The bonds and promises made in this treaty created a special relationship that is over 215 years old. It helps to remind us that we are all treaty people. This may start with a respectful recitation of the land acknowledgement, but we, as Torontonians, also have a duty to understand the terms of this treaty because it is our treaty too. Like a true partner in any binding contract, we must make sure our side of the agreement is being upheld and be mindful of where we fall short. Hungry for Comfort, a celebration of food history, explores culinary food stories hosted by the Toronto History Museums. This year, the spotlight is on Toronto's Chinese communities. These stories will educate, inspire, and connect you to the diverse Chinese culinary history on a safe online platform. We are excited to join our cultural curators, Arlene and Leo Chan, on a journey exploring Canada's Chinese communities. Arlene Chan is a well-known author and historian of Chinese culture in Canada, and Chef Leo Chan is a renowned Canadian professor. In conversation with members of the Chinese community, we will explore culinary stories that include speakers, panels, and cooking demonstrations. Thank you, Arlene and Leo. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you very much for your introduction. My husband Leo and I, we are so honored, so delighted to be asked to introduce and talk about Chinese food in Toronto. We have a great lineup of speakers, moderators, panelists, and chefs who will not only share their stories, their family stories, but also celebrate our great restaurant scene here in Toronto, past and present. In this episode of Hungry for Comfort, we're going to be covering the topic of authenticity, real Chinese food, authentic Chinese food. What does that mean? Is it really accurate to say there's real Chinese food? After what I think is going to be a very lively conversation, we're going to be in for a treat for having a cooking demonstration showing us a very popular Chinese dim sum delicacy. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Chef Wallace Wong. Wallace is not your typical chef because he's not only a chef, he's an entrepreneur, he's a TV and social media personality, and he is also a cancer survivor. Wallace has worked in some of the world's most respected restaurants. He was a finalist on Top Chef Canada and winner of Fridge Wars and Chopped Canada. And he also has represented Canada in fitness competitions. Wallace has built his brand, Sixpack Chef, around 3 pillars: eat good, look good, live great. So Wallace, these are really super impressive credentials. Not only are you successful in competitions for food, but also in competitions for fitness. So you've really, really earned your reputation for being the Sixpack Chef. Would you talk a bit more about your background and maybe tell us what you've been doing nowadays?
Thank you, Arlene, for that introduction. Really, really appreciate it. I'm honored to be here. A little bit about myself and who I am as Sixpack Chef. Like you said, it's my personal brand. It is my brand itself. I am a full-time content creator, and I do all media based on all things food, all things health and fitness, and all things lifestyle, entrepreneurship, and motivation. I'm so thrilled today to be moderating this session that features 2 distinguished authors who will be bringing very different perspectives about the very controversial topic, as you mentioned, what is authentic Chinese food? Now, one author traveled across Canada and visited Chinese restaurants, tasting, sampling the unique flavors and dishes that have become established as authentic Chinese food. And then our second guest, though, he's translated Yunming's Manual of Gastronomy, which is Recipes from the Garden of Contentment. Now, let's start off first with Ann. Ann Hui is the Globe and Mail's national food reporter. Her debut book, Chop Suey Nation, The Legion Cafe and Other Stories from Canada's Chinese Restaurants, was a national bestseller. Our second author, like I mentioned, translated and edited the 18th century Chinese culinary manual, Recipes from the Garden of Contentment, and studied its connection with modern Chinese cuisines of the diaspora. With that being said, I'd love to introduce both individuals. So let's start with Ann. Ann, before we get into your book, I'd love to sort of have you share your upbringing and in regards to your culinary story and how it actually influenced you to start writing about it.
So I grew up in Vancouver. My parents were both immigrants from southern China and Hong Kong. And so I grew up in, a household that was eating Cantonese food pretty much every day. And as you all probably know about the Chinese food scene in Vancouver, it's amazing. I would grow up going to amazing dim sum restaurants and going to the best Chinese barbecue and having all kinds of what we might consider authentic Chinese food. And yet from a young age, I started to realize that there was this other kind of Chinese food as well, everywhere around me. I would go to school and we would have Chinese food day, and it would be this food that looked completely unfamiliar to me, that looked exotic to me as a Chinese person. This kind of not made in China, made in North American Chinese food that I call as a shorthand chop suey Chinese. And so I was always really fascinated by this food. I was really interested in wanting to understand why there were all of these different kinds of ways of understanding, what Chinese food is and was. And so a couple of years ago, I took this road trip across Canada to visit as many of these chop suey houses, as many of these small town Chinese restaurants as I possibly could, to try to understand where this cuisine came from, to try to understand, what it was, if it wasn't authentic, and really just try to understand better what authenticity even means when it comes to any kind of cuisine. Got you.
I think when I read your book, the one thing that sort of resonated in how you meant was that we're both CBC. So we're both, Canadian born Chinese, and you from Vancouver, I'm from Toronto. And the thing was, like you mentioned, that when you grew up, we were accustomed to the sort of the Cantonese Chinese food we eat at home. And then when you had your Chinese day, you had sort of that westernized chop suey food, and you're like, what is that? For me, growing up, that was actually same thing. It was something not irregular to me because of my family being in the restaurant scene. So I grew up with that food as well. And my connection to that is simply just, that's like the Chinese food outside of the home. But that's super interesting. So you went across Canada, and how long was that trip, and how many stories are in this book, and why is chop suey so quintessential Canadian?
It was an 18-day road trip. We started in Victoria, BC, drove straight across the country all the way to the easternmost edge of this country, so Fogo Island, Newfoundland, which is pretty much the most remote place you can possibly imagine. Countless restaurants. I was going to 2, 3, sometimes more restaurants every single day, and many of them were in some of the tiniest, most isolated cities towns you can imagine in this country, towns of fewer than 500 people sometimes. So these were really kind of interesting little restaurants that seemed to be juxtaposed to the surroundings around them. And I still do, even though I've spent all these years now studying them, I find these restaurants fascinating. I find the people who are running these restaurants fascinating. What would motivate someone to move from China usually to a completely different country where they don't speak the language, where they don't know the customs, where often they don't have a lot of education or a lot of resources at their disposal, and why would they choose to be in these teeny tiny little towns where they're probably the only Chinese person there, where they don't speak the language? It just seems like this impossible situation. But what I really came to learn about these people and about these restaurants is that over and over and over again, they were telling these stories of endurance, of struggle, of incredible kind of entrepreneurial spirit. You know, these restaurants are there out of necessity. The people who run these restaurants initially started these restaurants because they literally didn't have any other options. Canada actually had in place in the late 19th century a whole system of policies and laws in place that actually banned Chinese people from most professional industries. And so one of the only options that was actually available to those Chinese people who were here in Canada was to run a restaurant. And so, you know, these people who often came from, you know, the railways or from working not in restaurants had to suddenly figure out how to start, you know, a business, how to cook food, how to cook Chinese food for primarily non-Chinese audiences. And so these restaurants are just really this kind of testament to, again, endurance, to that struggle, and to really coming out, I think, coming up with this really kind of beautiful answer to what was initially a really challenging and kind of ugly situation.
I think as you're talking, I connected even more so with it because that's actually how my family came over. It was through a restaurant. That was like their means of being able to come and survive. And a lot of times even, I always question myself when I go to say, I'm a big fisherman, so I love going fishing. And when we go to like the really north places or just driving, we're like, why is there in every single sort of town or city or municipality, there's that one random Chinese spot that in my head I always go through, and my parents when we're driving would be like, how did they get there? Why is like, how do they get their food, or why did they decide to be here? And a lot of friends and a lot of like industry chefs would even be like, you know what, I'm just gonna pack up, I'm gonna go find some remote location and open up a Chinese spot and make tons of money because I'll be the only Chinese restaurant there. But it's very, very interesting. And I think what your trip sounds like something that everybody would want to go. Real quick, I wanted to ask is, how did you decide what restaurants to go to? Was it more just you're going to hit every single one that you could sort of find, or did you come up with a list or had some like sort of tips on which restaurants to join?
I'd say it was like maybe 30% maybe pre-planned. So restaurants that I had done research on and identified before the trip as places that I wanted to go. So this is places like, you know, Stony Plain, Alberta, where the person who runs the Chinese restaurant in town also happens to be the mayor of the town. That's the kind of place, you know, I read up on in advance, and, you know, I booked an interview with him because, you know, I didn't want to miss the chance of meeting the mayor. But there were a lot of other places that were just kind of happy accidents as well. You know, some towns that I hadn't even planned on visiting, but maybe I'd gone to the town over first and that restaurant was closed, or maybe the owner was too busy to talk to me. And the beauty of doing a trip like this and writing a story and a book like this is that because there is a Chinese restaurant in every single small town, every time I might be shut down in a town, I could just go to the next town over and there would be another Chinese restaurant and I could try again. So it was a bit of a mixed bag.
Very true. Awesome. Well, thank you. And then we'll continue talking more about that. We're going to dive deeper into chop suey. Like, that's a term so familiar to me. With that being said, I'm going to start and introduce our second guest here. Now, Sean, I know that you literally have a completely different story to tell us compared to Ann's story and what she wrote. And I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Ann, which is, how did you get into culinary, or what is your culinary story? And how did that lead you to decipher and translate this holy grail of a recipe book, if you will?
Well, I mean, from my early teens and continue really now even to my adulthood, I've always been interested in Chinese cuisine, but I guess in a more, a peripheral sense, right? In many Chinese families, I think, the motivation for the parents is to just get your kids to university and have some sort of a major in which you can, make a living, at least better than the one that they had. So I think, for the most part of my life, I've always kind of thought about Chinese food as something on the side, and, it's fun to look at, but I think, it sort of became and started as an interest in just really knowing how things worked, right? How do you make soy sauce? How do you do, certain very, more basic raw ingredients? And I started to dig into Chinese culinary history for this reason, and to really discover where recipes came from. But it's kind of like a hole that you keep on digging, and you just get completely engrossed in like the rich and complex history of the cuisine and itself, and the scholarship behind it. And this eventually led me to a point which I discovered this book, the Sui Ren Shi Dan. And being somebody who's not fantastic in reading Chinese, what do? You go and you look for an English translation, right? And what I found was that for this really significant book, there really wasn't any English translations. It was translation in parts, maybe in snippets, but nothing complete. And so what I actually ended up deciding to do was, I'm going to do it myself. I'm just going to read it and see what happens. And it was absolutely horrific. I mean, it took forever to do the first even section. However, once that's done, I said to myself, I'm never going to do this again. And I went back and I did it again. And this eventually went on for a few months, and I decided I'm just going to publish all of it. And by the end of a few years, I found I actually had a really large collection of translations, and so I put them online. And I did this with actually several books now. And you start to notice a trend, a pattern in which Chinese cuisine itself has changed a huge amount over hundreds of years. I mean, when you say it, it doesn't, it makes sense in some ways, but when you look at it in context of everything, when people say, what is Chinese cuisine? People have a very static idea of, oh, this is Chinese cuisine, this is Peking duck. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, when you look at it historically, when you look at it in terms of the diaspora and the interactions with other cultures, all of a sudden you say to yourself, wow, this is a really dynamic thing. It's changes all the time. And this is how I really got into translating the rest of this book, the Sui Ren Shi Dan, and actually digging into Chinese cuisine a lot more.
Got you. Now, I wanted to ask you this, so you're first an engineer. You're an engineer first. And then you got into food, and you mentioned how you were trying to figure out how things work, how recipes were, and sort of trying to figure that out. I want to know is, how did you land on this book specifically? Like, why was it this book first? Or like, did you just randomly stumble upon it, or were you looking for that sort of cuisine?
I mean, for this book in particular, because when you start to look into recipes, so I mean, I started actually not on recipes, I looked at ingredients specifically, right? So where does wheat come from? Why do people start eating wheat? Why do people abandon another grain like millet? Millet was huge in China, like it was the thing, and then people abandoned it. Why? So I started looking at these things, and time after time, every single book on Chinese culinary history always bounced back to this book, the Sui Ren Shi Dan, or in this case, I call it the Recipe from the Garden of Contentment. So they keep on mentioning this book, but after several mentions, of course, you start to realize, okay, in research, you got to look into it. What is it? And when I started to try to find this book in an English version, it doesn't exist. So of course, you're curious, and so you start reading it. And I know, after some terrible times in my early teens, being forced to learn Chinese, eventually it came to use, right? I started reading, oh, you too. All right, I think it's a collective experience here.
Everybody.
All right. So it came to you. So I started reading it. But the problem with this book itself is that it is not the Chinese that we know, right? This is actually classical Chinese. It's a completely different animal altogether. The sort of example I give is like, if you know English, I guess elementary English, right? I know elementary Chinese. if you are trying to read something from some legalese, I mean, this is similar to that kind of a jump. You are not able to completely understand what is going on because the reading itself has its own rules. The words have its own rules. And again, even the punctuation, you have to be able to stick it in the right places because it is unpunctuated. So this kind of things that, I had to learn all by myself. And in hindsight, it would probably have been better if somebody had a guide published open source, but it didn't exist back then. So I had to do it all by myself. And eventually, this is how it came to this book. You dug deep enough, so you have to keep on digging. And so that's why I stuck with it.
Got it. Question is, how big is this book? Is it
How big is it? I mean, eventually translated, we talk about font size. Anyways, this book turned out to be around 300 pages. But, you have to consider that there's a lot of footnotes because remember the foods that he talked about, even the fact that, colloquially they call ingredients different things. It took some research to figure out what they are. Or, if you're talking about a part of an animal, you have to figure out which part of that animal actually went to the recipe. So there's a lot of footnoting, both on the ingredients, the historical context, the people, even the weights and measures themselves. So, I mean, there's a lot of this kind of discovery going on, but it is also through this work that you start to discover that, Chinese cuisine is, I guess my conception of Chinese cuisine previously was actually very limited in thinking that, it's just, Char Siu Bao, and then you have like the Ha Gao Siu Mai, which, the ladies with their carts kind of scream out at you. But you start to realize like, there's actually a lot of very interesting baked goods, a lot of them deriving from Central Asia, things that are actually European. I mean, all of these things all together that you don't actually expect from a cuisine that is 200 or 300 years old that was described in this book. So you start to see that the connections are very much there. And in order to really think about what is Chinese cuisine and what is diasporic Chinese cuisine, we have to think, in fact, very globally, very early on.
Awesome. I think with that big overall, it's such a great sort of juxtaposition here in regards to, for myself, someone who is looking at both of the different types of Chinese food that you guys have written and described, where for Ann, that's chop suey, all those kind of nuclear red sauces and spring rolls and all those things. Those are so familiar to me. But at the same time, the dishes, the pickles, the braised meats and all the ferment and the millet that you describe, Sean, in your book, that's super familiar to me. And that's where my foundation is as a CBC chef who loves both modern and traditional Chinese food, and I use that as the base. Now, with that being said, I'd love to bring it on to what the whole topic of this whole discussion tonight was: hungry for comfort and what is authentic Chinese food. Now, I, for myself, would love to start asking you guys is, what is your favorite comfort food or comfort foods? And I'll give you guys mine first so then you guys can have a little time to think. But for me, there's just this one thing that always comes to mind, which is hot pot. So hot pot for me is something that's super comforting because I usually have it when it's cold. So like it's nice and hot and warm and comforting. It's always communal. So it's communal, it's family, it's always everyone around, and it's more than just, eating and leaving. We're there for maybe more than 30 minutes to an hour, and we're constantly adding new things. And it reminds me of like, we'll make dumplings together and we'll put everything together. So hot pot to me is what I consider comfort food. What do you guys consider comfort food? Doesn't have to be Chinese food at all. So, Anne, maybe you can start first.
Noodles of any kind, any shape, form. If we're gonna get super specific, noodles and soup. Yeah, but really, I mean, I've never met a noodle that I didn't like. And I've only recently started with the pandemic making my own noodles, and I've only done it a couple of times, so I'm not gonna act like I'm some kind of an expert or that even the results were any good. But it's it's been really nice, I think, this last year, learning to cook things that I might not otherwise have spent the time learning how to cook, and just really enjoying the process of preparing simple, nourishing, delicious things for me and my family.
Awesome. I think noodles is definitely comforting, and there's like a specific noodle dish or style that I've always wanted to try, which was like the bamboo jumping noodles, like the one from like Hong Kong. I don't know if Sean or Ann, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So do you know what we're talking about, Ann, by chance?
No, it's the biang biang mian that I tried making recently. I don't know the bamboo jumping ones.
So the bamboo jumping one is like this very lost art where generations don't want to do it anymore because it's very taxing. It's one person. It's literally a guy. He'll have the dough and he'll become the mixer. So he'll actually just hop onto this big giant bamboo.
Yeah, I've seen that.
And he'll jump, and like I remember I watched videos of it, and he would talk about like it's hard work. It's also not the best health-wise for a man or a woman to constantly be jumping hours and hours a day doing that. But the way that they describe the noodles, the texture, the bounce, everything that we want is interesting. And I think that's something. Sean, what's your comfort food? What makes you be like, yes, that's me?
I'm gonna go traditional, and actually, for me, it's always the thing that I come back to, and it's rice, and it's actually the specific Japanese kind of sticky rice that I go back to, and I don't really know why, but I mean, this is the thing that during the times in which it's most stressful, that's what I head back to, and usually the toppings tend to be something pickled and something preserved. So some sort of preserved vegetables, some sort of preserved meat, and during this pandemic, I think it is also a reconnection to that culture, right? There's something very comforting, not just eating it, but being able to take some raw ingredients and do something transformational, and it affirms your connection to not only those ingredients themselves in their raw forms, but also to the culture and the knowledge base that allows you to do this transformative work, to take something that is potentially inedible and turn them into something that's nourishing for a family. And so I think this is it. It's rice and pickled stuff. I don't know if that's appealing to anyone, but there you go.
Absolutely. That brings me a question. So I'd love to ask for you both of you guys, because I'm sure all of us, we eat rice. We all made rice in some way or some form. Let's sort of demyth this here. How do you guys measure the amount of water level to your rice? That's how you know you're a real Asian, when you use your finger. Well, Sean, what do you use?
It depends actually on the type of rice. It depends on the type of rice, right? Yeah, you use the finger method, definitely. But for example, if you do japonica, which is like the sushi rice, right? You have to soak. So there's like rice which you don't have to soak, and then you have to soak. And for the japonicas, you soak, but after you soak it and it's fully like all soaked, you actually keep it directly on the surface. That's like one way. But if you cook any other one like jasmine, then you use the finger method. Or if you do something like basmati, you use the finger method. And if you use like, what is that? Glutinous rice, that's it, glutinous rice. It's actually a finger and a little bit more. I mean, it really depends. And so you're so engrossed in this. Anyways, off topic. Sorry, go on.
100%. I totally agree. So you guys go with the first knuckle?
Halfway to the first knuckle from the top of the rice.
Yeah. And is that what you do too, Sean?
Fingernail.
See? I was gonna say, I've done it with both, and they both somehow work. And this is coming from a chef, which is like the most weirdest thing ever, because we're like, it worked one time, it should work the same time. But I totally agree. But it's interesting. And I also, from learning from the French way of culinary school and stuff, the ratio for rice and water was always 1 to 1.5. It was never right. 1 to 1.5 was never right. I always say that, and I was like, why? It's not the truth. And then I always go 1 to 1, and then I'll just add a little bit more, but just everything's a little bit more. And now that we talk about rice, talk about noodles, talk about hot pot, I wanted to ask you guys, is there a specific food that's universally considered comfort? Is there even a Chinese food or a Chinese dish that is universally, everybody would, no matter what, will consider as comfort? It's hard. I was thinking of that too.
I don't know that I could name one specific dish, but one thing that I have definitely been struck by in, these last few years of researching and then writing and then talking endlessly about Chinese restaurants and talking to people about Chinese restaurants is just how many non-Chinese people, especially, but everybody's favorite comfort food is Chinese. And I think that's really kind of incredible if you think about it. How many people will cite Chinese food as their comfort food, number one. If you think about the history of this country, only really having very significant immigration from China in the last 50 years or so, and the fact that so many people will cite this kind of food as their favorite, and not just their favorite, but their most comforting, I think is just really meaningful and really speaks to the kind of impact that Chinese culture and Chinese communities have had on this country.
Sean, what do you think? Do you think that there's a universal comfort food?
I think it depends from culture to culture. I think that's the cop-out way of doing it, right? But I would say that, is there a universal comfort food for Chinese people? I think it's also very difficult to say something like that because, it's really, if you look at China itself, it's a gigantic landmass. Overlay it on top of Europe, it's really hard to pin down any specific dish. And when we think of Chinese culture itself, a lot of people tend to think of it as something monolithic. And really it isn't, right? I never like to say Chinese culture, I like to say Chinese cultures, because it's not just there's so many cultures inside that landmass, but all over the world. My experience as a Chinese Canadian that, have roots in southern China, in Singapore, is completely different from somebody else's experience that is a Chinese of, South Asian sort of upbringing, or somebody who has immigrated to Zimbabwe or South Africa in order to become all of a sudden Chinese Canadian because they've immigrated against us. The collective experience, our lived experience, is larger than any label. So to come back to, is there a comfort food? I think that maybe there are certain things, if you in your upbringing have rice or noodles of that certain kind, then most likely you will go back to those in times in which you need some comfort. But otherwise, I would say it's very varied. So, somebody would like rice with, I don't know, ground meat on top. Some weird guy would like pickled and weird stuff on their rice, like me. But I think someone else would like noodles and something else.
Awesome. I think that's a great leeway, because what you talked about everyone has their sort of standpoint and viewpoint or what is comfort. And at that same time, I think this is the great spot to translate into everybody sort of has a viewpoint on what is authentic Chinese food. And that's something I think we're going to go right into right now, because all three of us here have a different perspective on what authentic Chinese food is and what authenticity means, right? And in terms of authenticity, the definition of it is undisputed origin, it's genuine. So for me as a chef, I look at authenticity as something to be respected for, something that's a guideline, something that we use to build on, but it's also a time and place, meaning it's authentic to that moment, that time. I know that both of you guys have a different perspective on it, and I'd love to ask each of you guys, what does authenticity mean for you in regards to food, and specifically in regards to Chinese food? Anne, would you like to start?
Sure. I think that Sean has already done a really nice job of laying a lot of the groundwork for this conversation and just talking about how diverse, if we're talking specifically about Chinese cuisine, then the cuisines of China are, it's a huge country, as Sean has said, and some of the foods, I remember some of the foods from different regions of China that I've only tried for the first time maybe in the last decade or so. I probably wouldn't have even recognized as Chinese food if somebody hadn't explained it to me. And so I think that the idea or the term or the use of the word authenticity in food is a misnomer. I think that, as Sean has explained, this is a cuisine, just like all cuisines around the world, that has shifted, has changed, has evolved over time. Forget about one specific place. I mean, take a dish like mala tofu. It's a Sichuanese dish, but if you went, even if you were to go to, the very town in which it was first created, forget about from restaurant to restaurant to restaurant, each one would have a different variation of that same dish. I mean, if you went from household to household to household, family to family to family, one grandma to the next grandma to the next grandma, they would probably argue to their deathbeds about what the right version of this one dish is. There is no such thing. And so for us to try to pin down this thing that is ever changing, I think is just, it's kind of, it's a bit of a fool's game. I also feel like the word authentic, when it comes to food, has, especially in the last 5-10 years or so, we're seeing a lot of people really interested in chasing the most authentic Sichuan restaurant, the most authentic Napoli style pizza, the most authentic bolognese, whatever, and wanting to have that very authentic experience. I think that whole idea and the way that the word authentic is used, it just comes often with so much baggage. It's often very loaded and often takes on this really kind of uneven power dynamic. And so it becomes a really problematic word. I can unpack that, but I feel like I should let Sean have a chance to chime in.
Absolutely. Sean, authenticity, authentic Chinese food. What does that mean? Like, for someone who's went through and translated, I'm not going to call it a recipe book anymore, but a history book.
Well, I would just go on from where Anne left off. I mean, really, it ends up being a power dynamic. This is all about power at the end. And just from reading the recipe of Garden of Contentment itself, we know that there are several versions of what people think of as authentic. You have one of them basically say like, it's basically a dish that's faithful to some original, or that it's somehow devoid of foreign or external influences, or that is prepared by somebody with the right genetic makeup, right? One of these, and you see various versions of one of these kind of veins of authenticity. But if you read from the Garden of Contentment and indeed many other historical sort of culinary works, you realize that, first of all, there was never one original there, and that it was always foreign influences left and right. So just from the recipes of Garden of Contentment, it is just littered with stuff that has a Turkic, Persian, European influences, and they're often mentioned without much fanfare, as if it was just like, whatever. It's just another thing that's around that we eat, on a semi-regular basis. And so you realize that there is no original, and that there was always foreign influence. And when you come back to, this idea. So what about this whole thing about genetic makeup, race, genes, whatever? And Renwei actually said inside the book very eloquently that this is all true. He himself said that you need to have a deep understanding of the culture that created the cuisine. You can recreate that cuisine. So he said here, when one is exposed to a cultural foundations and trained in its methods from a young age, one can become extremely adept in the culture's cuisine. And it brings back to this front center, there's no genetic ancestry to allow for the transmission of a cuisine, but it's really the understanding of the culture and the techniques for creating that food. But I think this is the problem with talking about authenticity. And really it requires a kind of a mental gymnastics, but I'm going to try to do it here. It basically says, because these three terms is kind of contradictory. On one hand, it says that any path of culinary knowledge is rightly authentic on its own merit. So, you receive from watching your grandma cook, that's okay. But if you coerce it from a stranger on a scribble of paper, that's equally authentic in its own right? Sure. In its own story, in its own path. But once you try to pin any recipe or any cuisine down to an original or something that is non-foreign, all of a sudden the term loses its, meaning. It's completely arbitrary. So it means that, what really means that authenticity is anything that you as a person or a society as a group want it to be. Everything is authentic and nothing is authentic. Does that make any sense? It's like, say, we all love General Tao chicken. I love it. I love General Tao chicken, with my heart. But what it means is that General Tao chicken, in its path of its creation, is authentic as in any Peking duck, any fish with ginger and sesame sauce on top of it. But the moment in which you try to pull apart, to dissect it using some arbitrary thing, saying that, oh, this is a foreign thing, oh, this is not original, then neither General Tso's chicken or Peking duck or anything is authentic. And I think this is the kind of unpacking that we have to do with authenticity to really put it back in its place, to depower it in when it could be used in a harmful sense. And I think it is used in a very harmful sense in many cases. So I don't know if that makes any sort of sense of what I'm trying to say in terms of authenticity, but it only makes sense when you see all of this in power, because in any other way, it really doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have any meaning to it.
Absolutely. I think with our prior talks and into now, that whole, what you said was everything's authentic and nothing's really authentic. And I think from there, it's like when Ann, you said the mala tofu, right? I've done that and I put that on fresh gnocchi before, and I've made mala gnocchi. That to me is authentic my dish. Which it comes back to what Sean, you said, it's authentic at that point. But if I was to bring this back and be like, is my mala gnocchi authentically Chinese or is it authentically Italian? It's neither. It's authentically mine. And why I think the more and more we're uncovering is authenticity is not stagnant. It's constantly depending on the time, the place. If we all three of us decide to create a dish right now, that would be authentically for that moment. And I think with what Ann, you said, was that it's the word authenticity gets loaded with a lot of baggage, a lot of some negativity, a lot of things that are going on. And Sean, you also have that same sort of viewpoint in regards to it's a lot of power assertion. And I'd love for both of you guys to sort of just unopen a little bit about what that negativity or what that baggage or those shackles of the word authenticity does to Chinese food and does to any culture in general.
So just to use an example of the kind of harm or baggage that I'm describing, and I may not be getting the details right because it's been a while since I actually first learned of this, but there was a study that was done a number of years ago into restaurant reviews. It was like a study into like a Yelp type website and what general public were saying about different cuisines, different types of cuisines online. And they did a search for the word authentic and how people talked about different kinds of cuisines. So how they used the word authentic when they were describing, say, Chinese restaurants versus the word authentic when they were talking about different types of European restaurants, maybe Italian, French restaurants, etc. And in the European sense, authentic tended to be, it was definitely viewed as a good thing, but it was often, talking about, charming decor or the ambiance or, whatever the specifics of the food were. But when it came specifically to Chinese food, the word authentic almost always tended to be talking about a very specific idea of, a hole-in-the-wall restaurant. They often talked about, a restaurant was graded as being more authentic if it was seen as, unclean, or if the servers don't speak English, then it's authentic. If they only give you a Chinese menu, that there are all these ideas, I think, wrapped up, that bring along kind of racial stereotypes, and again, just this kind of baggage when people talk about authenticity in different kinds of cuisine, and so that's the kind of harm that I see used, and when you're talking about, your own experience, Wallace, as a CBC chef, what I've definitely heard in speaking with other kind of second generation millennial chefs who come from immigrant backgrounds, usually people of color, they talk about the fact that, when they go out into the restaurant world, often they feel that because of their race, or because of, their parents' background or their ethnic background, that they are expected to cook that kind of food. They're kind of pigeonholed into that cuisine. And not only that cuisine, but in a very specific view, a very stagnant view of what that cuisine is. So if you as a Chinese chef maybe step into a kitchen, people might expect you, Wallace, to cook Chinese cuisine, and not just any Chinese cuisine, but authentic Chinese cuisine. You are tied to this idea of what authentic Chinese food is, whereas someone who didn't have your color of skin, somebody who wasn't a person of color, probably doesn't have to deal with all of those ideas and those challenges.
Absolutely, I totally agree. I think for me as a second gen CBC chef, absolutely, I've worked in, Italian restaurants, French restaurants, Nordic restaurants, modern, all these kind of different restaurants, and I love using food and that to spin it into a more opposite grass green on the other side. Is I love when I can use authentic sort of dishes as a leeway to educate and teach more about our culture, so that it's not always into that pigeonhole. So like, as I mentioned, like for instance, that mala gnocchi, it's a way to be able to teach people, this is mala, this is what Szechuan cuisine is, this is, the peppercorns, and start getting into that and showing that there's more to it than what everyone is supposed to think about and those shackles. Sean, for you, what's that baggage? What is that power, that assertion using the word authenticity?
I think when you say authentic, it's we can no longer really look at it just in terms of, what is the food, what are the ingredients, what are the techniques, right? It's really about what people are trying to say about themselves and others. Really, when somebody says authentic, your thing is authentic, my thing is authentic, it is not. What they're really talking about is, what am I trying to label you as? What am I trying to label myself as? It depends on who has the power to label themselves or other, and what that label says about the identity of those people that are being labeled. And at the end, the people who use authenticity as a label reveals as much about themselves as much as those that are being labeled, whether those being labeled accept or resist that label. So what do I mean by that? It means that, when I say my dishes are authentic, the fact that I have to say that they're authentic says something about myself, right? So, when European chefs you actually rarely, and they've done studies on this, they don't usually say authentic about their cuisine. It assumes that when you're eating at a European restaurant, when you're going to be paying out of your wallet by a large margin, it means that it's going to be an interpretation, and people are okay with that. But however, if you go to another Chinese restaurant, basically a lot of restaurants have to somehow label authentic in order to promote themselves. And I think this is what I mean. You have to show yourself about the confidence of your identity by having to use certain words or not. And so you see, this kind of, and the reason why this is, of course, problematic is because you kind of buy into what is being labeled on you by society, by having to say authentic or not, or having to resist it or not. And so while I would like to say that we don't want to continue to use this word in, I guess it's more negative ways, it ultimately it's a double-edged sword, right? By trying to label yourself, you are still saying somebody else as inauthentic, just as when you're saying something else is inauthentic, that you're saying yourself as somehow authentic. I mean, you think about it, there's always a reverse reaction in either way, so you're still always causing harm. And so I think the term authenticity, we know has some problems with it. And the most important thing is to realize what is actually happening when people are saying something is authentic or not, and be able to really make conscious what that means. So, you order General Tao chicken. I like it. I just keep on using that as an example because I like it. And you see this all the time. Actually, when there was a, I think it's Hongxing, I can't remember now, but I go there and then you eat your lunch just quietly, and then you look at the next table, somebody orders it, and whoever will go with them, like they roll their eyes, it's not authentic, right? You see this actually quite a bit, surprisingly, even nowadays. And I say to that person, man, if I could go back in time and do that, you ordered that General Tao chicken because you deserve it. Not only because you deserve it, but I mean it's delicious. But if you look at it from the whole thing that we're talking about here, it's just that there's no bearing, there's no objective good definition to authenticity, and that when you see that as simply a power play, somebody is trying to push you down or pull themselves up by using that word authenticity, you can then decide what you're going to do in that situation, right? So it's irregardless of how that General Tao chicken tastes, or even if you're ordering it, but by knowing that that person is doing something by using authenticity to do something to you or themselves, the situation better. And I think this is the kind of thing that we have to think about when we hear that term. It's not that we shouldn't use it or we should use it. It's more that what does the situation demand? Politically, what are you going to do at the moment? And I think this is actually more where authenticity lies.
I do love General Tao chicken. That brings me to a point now, because before speaking to you guys, I never ever thought of the points that you guys brought up in regards to the shackles, the baggage, the connotations, all that kind of stuff, as a negative thing to the word authentic. For me, it was always like authenticity is, I've only seen one side of it. But I love the fact that I've educated, and you guys have educated me on those things, and I see it and I understand it. And that brings me to this final point I want to ask you guys, and I think it's going to be the best to figure it out, and how we can work to make authenticity much more a positive thing without removing some of those shackles and baggages. So how can we use the word authentic properly? What's the right way and what's the wrong way? For me, I think authenticity used in a proper way is to just simply, like I mentioned with the mala tofu, is show the origins, but build on it. And not have to force it through someone's, in their face, or sell it that, hey, this is the way it is, this is how it's supposed to be, it's authentically that. It's more of, it's a time and place, and you want to be prideful of whatever that dish is. So that's my thoughts. What about your thoughts? What's the right way, what's the wrong way to use that word?
think that there is necessarily a rule that can be used across the board that would be particularly useful. You know, I don't think either Sean or I I shouldn't speak for you, Sean, but I know I am not saying that, you know, you should not use the word authentic. That is definitely not the message that I want to convey. You know, I use the word all the time because like it or not, it is a useful kind of shorthand to describe a specific thing. I would, I guess, urge anyone out there who wants to be maybe more thoughtful about these things is that just to be thoughtful about their use of the word and try, you know, their best to understand the histories in which you know, some of these cuisines come from, to try to understand some of these traditions and just the broader context. You know, for me, this whole journey again begins with this kind of chop suey cuisine, begins with, you know, the General Tao chicken that Sean so fondly has brought up many times already. This is food that is constantly slagged in popular culture now as inauthentic. You know, it's considered fake Chinese, it's considered not real. I was guilty of that at one point as well. But, you know, when you start to peel back those layers and you start to learn the history of this food, you realize that this was food that was created because the restaurant owners were just trying to come up with a cuisine that white people would like, basically. You know, they didn't have Chinese customers who were used to Chinese flavors and who wanted to buy this food. They were serving primarily white audiences in white towns. Many of them had never tried any kind of non-traditional Canadian food, whatever that means. Certainly many of them had never tried Chinese food before. And so this was food that was really created to cater to those palates, you know, to an audience that maybe wasn't very ready for and probably wasn't quite that accepting of authentic Chinese food. So when you take into account that struggle, that long history of discrimination that this food faced, and then you look at the product of that food, you know, these chop suey dishes, and then for anyone to come in and slap a label of inauthentic, you know, given that history, given that kind of specific you know, the line from here to there is I think kind of ridiculous. And so that's the kind of thing that I mean when I say that, you know, I think we all have a responsibility to educate ourselves, to try to understand history, and to try to understand these foods that we're talking about before we, you know, try to just slap labels all over things.
Absolutely. Sean, I'm going to let you close this out. Real quick, is there a right or is there a wrong way, or has Ann sort of covered it all?
I think Ann really covered much of it. Really, it just comes down to realizing that when you say authenticity, when you talk about cuisine, especially Chinese Canadian cuisine, this is a cuisine developed in order to protect the community, in order to nourish the family, and do so in a very sort of often confrontational environment. So when we try to label authenticity onto any cuisine, and to realize that many of our cuisines, indeed global cuisines, derive from these same needs, I think in some ways, you know, is unfair and in some ways insulting to the history and the context, the historical context in which those cuisines and those dishes are derived. And so, yeah, I mean, for me, going back, authenticity is always about who gets to say it? Why are you saying it? And so, is there a right place to do it? I think, you know, it really depends on context. And I think going back again to how I say it's really a power dynamic. It depends on what your situation is, when you want to invoke it or not, and to realize, what are you doing when you are actually using that word? Because as I also mentioned, authenticity and that label is actually a double-edged sword. So when you shackle someone, what are you actually saying that about yourself versus the other way around, vice versa?
I think then to wrap this up is when you're using the word authentic, it's all about just being cautious of how you're using it and why you're using it, and that everything is authentic and everything is really not authentic. So I want to thank you, Ann and Sean, for this amazing conversation. Loved hearing about what authentic Chinese food is and what authenticity is, and just the whole hungry for comfort. And I'd love to pass things on back to Arlene. And for those watching, please feel free to go check out the links in the video underneath for both Ann's book and Sean's book.
Well, listening to Ann, Wallace, and Sean talking about Chinese food is a great segue into the next part of our program, which is a cooking demonstration by Chef Eric Chong. So Eric's true calling has always been cooking, even though he has a degree in chemical engineering. He was determined to earn his spot in the culinary world after becoming first Master Chef Canada. Together with his mentor, Alvin Leong, Eric now runs R&D, a modern eatery paying tribute to traditional Asian flavors. So Eric, after winning MasterChef Canada, your dream of opening a restaurant has been realized with R&D restaurant right in our Chinatown at Spadina and Dundas. And I know since you won MasterChef Canada, you've been very, very busy, not only running your restaurant, but also doing so many other exciting projects. Can you tell us about these?
Sure, yeah. So when I won MasterChef Canada, it was about almost 7 years ago now. Actually, more than 7 years ago. So there's a lot of time to cover. But more or less, I think the most exciting parts post-winning would have to be traveling with Alvin, of course. Various parts of Asia. We got to film Walk the World together, which was a show that aired all throughout Asia. We traveled to places that I would have never been able to even go to, even think of going to, like Dubai. Thailand was very exciting. And then all these little beautiful parts in China, which were gorgeous, learning about how rice is grown. Besides traveling and filming, I've been doing a few partnerships. So I've partnered up with TNT to do a few marketing campaigns, as well as Miele Canada most recently. And it's just been very, very fulfilling, I'd say, extremely satisfying. So like, unlike when I was a chemical engineer, I didn't really feel like my passion, I didn't really feel driven, but most recently, especially during the pandemic, my industry has definitely been hit the most, but I'm very fortunate that we're still doing takeout and they're still busy, and I'm busy doing other partnerships as well.
So I know you're going to be cooking up a very special dish for us today. So can you tell us what the dish is and why you chose this one?
So the dish that I'll be cooking today is called CSB on the menu because a lot of people struggle to pronounce it, but the dish is actually Char Siu Bao. So Char Siu being Chinese barbecue pork and Bao, of course, being bun. And I chose to do this because a lot of people who actually have dim sum and have Chinese cuisine believe that, I believe that they've had Char Siu Bao before. So like whenever you go out to eat a Chinese restaurant or dim sum, you either have Ha Gao Siu Mai and Char Siu Bao. At least those are the trinity for me. So at least people can relate to it. But what makes R&D so different is that we make everything from scratch for one, including the barbecue pork. We use pork shoulder. So it's like a nice piece of the pork that we marinate, brine, roast, glaze, dice up, mix with a house-made bao sauce. And then what makes ours extremely unique would be the bun. So the bun we use like a milk bun. It's similar to a brioche. It's catered obviously to Canadians since we like things buttery, soft, and of course sweeter. So it's a nice, unique spin on the classic sweet and savory barbecue pork bun.
Boy, this sounds really delicious. So let's have a look at the cooking demonstration.
Hi, I'm Eric Chong. I'm the first winner of MasterChef Canada, also co-owner of R&D Restaurant here in Chinatown, Toronto. Today we'll be making CSB, one of our signature dishes, Char Siu Bao. So first, to make the bun, we actually derived it from a signature brioche. We like things buttery, sweet. You have some bread flour, salt, yeast, sugar, egg, whole milk, and of course butter, because everybody likes a buttery bun. So to start off, we will add our yeast to the whole milk. This is like activating the yeast. Gently whisk it. You can see here once it starts foaming, you know the yeast is still alive. Sometimes an advantage of doing this would be if your yeast is dead, if you haven't stored it properly, it wouldn't really foam up, and then you know your brioche bun won't actually proof. At this stage, you can also add your egg. Break that up. Now, a lot of people believe that you have to start with warm milk to activate it, but since we will be kneading it quite aggressively, the heat from mixing it will actually activate the yeast itself. So while that's blooming, we can add our dry ingredients to the mixer. Bread flour, salt, and sugar. Whenever you're making a brioche bun, you always want to have a lot of sugar. And whenever you're working with yeast, sugar actually helps the bread proof, because the yeast actually takes in the sugar and turns it into carbon dioxide, which adds the bubbles and to proof your bun. Very good. Now you can see the yeast is slowly starting to foam up. At this stage, we can turn our mixer onto low and add our wet ingredients. Now at this stage, I usually like to just poke down the sides with a thin spatula, and this really helps incorporate the flour. Now you never want to start with the mixer on high speed, because you'll shoot the flour everywhere and you'll over knead the dough. You want to gently incorporate the flour. Great. So now at this stage, when you kind of have a moppy mass where almost all the flour is incorporated, you can add the butter. If you notice, I always weigh the butter in the bowl you're going to end up proofing your dough in, because you can nicely butter the bowl. Now you have a nice buttered bowl. You didn't have to waste another bowl just to weigh out your butter. Very good. Now that you see the dough starting to come together, you can start turning up the speed of the mixer to really incorporate and start kneading this dough. So you know your dough is almost done kneading when the full mixer is nice and clean. If you notice, all that flour, all that butter has mopped up nicely. But to truly see if your dough has developed enough gluten, you can just take a little piece and do the window test. So the window test is pretty much stretching it out to almost translucent without it breaking, like so. And what this does is it shows you that the dough has developed enough gluten. That way when you make your buns and they bake, they're not going to explode all over you. So we're just going to knead this into a nice ball. So the perfect surface to knead any dough would be a cutting board. A wooden one, a plastic one, it doesn't really matter, as long as it's a clean, even surface. If you are using a cutting board, I'd recommend putting a wet towel underneath it so it doesn't slide around. All right, once you have a nice smooth ball, we're going to place it in our bowl to proof. You're going to let that dough proof until it doubles in size. So if you put it somewhere warm, that could be 30 minutes or 1 hour. If it's somewhere cooler, it may take up to 4 hours. Here we have a nice portion of the dough that's already been proofed. And in the restaurant, we always want things very consistent, so that if a customer comes at like 5 p.m. on Friday or on Sunday, you want every bun to look the same. So of course, we're gonna have to weigh and portion the dough. For us, each bun weighs 40 grams. That is the ideal size. I always do a nice small taster dough. So we're gonna roll this out till it's nice and smooth, and the top will be the show side. It's very important to get these round and as smooth as possible, because if you don't, your bun won't be smooth and it won't look nice and round either. And dim sum's extremely important to me, because my grandfather used to be a dim sum chef. He used to have his own restaurant in Toronto. He would create all sorts of authentic Asian dishes as well as authentic dim sum. So growing up, he'd always show me how to make things like hagao, or like your shrimp dumpling, steam buns, and of course, Char Siu Bao. But where I drew inspiration from this dish was when I was traveling around Hong Kong. There is one Michelin-starred restaurant that strictly does dim sum, and that is Tim Ho Wan. And they do a nice baked, sweet and savory barbecue pork bun. And I thought I'd do a Canadian version with a brioche bun, because Canadians like things very sweet, very buttery, and very flaky. So drew inspiration from Tim Ho Wan, but of course this is R&D's very own unique Char Siu Bao. It has a very buttery outside, a nice crispy sweet exterior, and then our house-made barbecue pork. So if you don't have the luxury of making your own barbecue pork, you can definitely buy your own barbecue pork from any store in like Chinatown or any supermarket. And we're gonna mix the barbecue pork with our house-made Char Siu Bao sauce. So to make this sauce, it's pretty simple. You can actually make it your own. Ours contains a stock made of wok-fried ginger, scallions, a little bit of white pepper, oyster sauce, light and dark soy, and then set with 2 types of starches. So the key elements you need in your Char Siu Bao sauce is, of course, that nice smoky ginger scallion aroma, but as well as both light and dark soy. A lot of people always ask, why do you have light and dark soy? Dark soy is more for the color and that deep flavor. And then light soy you just use for that umami and savoriness. And of course you have a lot of sugar in here. The 2 starches we use is potato starch and cornstarch. So cornstarch helps set it almost like a jello when it's cold, and potato starch gives you that nice gooiness. So like, if you imagine a mac and cheese, it has that nice cheese pull or gooiness. We want that in a Char Siu Bao. So when you bite into it, it oozes out of flavor. It's extremely important that you start your stock, have it very cold. Everything has to be cold so that it stays in solid form, because when you bake it, it'll obviously be in liquid form. When the stock gets a bit warmer, it's extremely difficult to fold. So the ratio is 1:1. So we have 500 grams pork, 500 grams of sauce, for example. We're gonna incorporate that. I would recommend, if you're gonna try making Char Siu Bao, make a lot of dough, because the challenge isn't necessarily the filling, it's about folding it right. I will get to that point, but it's extremely important that all ends are sealed and you don't overstuff it. A lot of people, when they make Char Siu Bao, they get very ambitious. They're like, yeah, more meat, more sauce, get it in there. But actually, a good Char Siu Bao has a perfect balance of dough and filling. You really want to appreciate a nice buttery brioche and a nice savory sauce. You don't want too much meat and too much sauce and not get enough bread. It's all about the ratio. Great. Now, we are going to get to stuffing the dough. So it's important to flatten the edges, but not the center, because if everything is reversed. So this is the show side. You're gonna flip it upside down and flatten it gently. And then we're gonna stretch out the sides, almost like a pizza dough, if you will. But again, you don't want the center too thin. The reason being, that is the top, and if that is too thin, all the char siu is just gonna explode from the top of there. I'm gonna spread this nice and wide. The wider you can get the dough, the easier it will be to fold, and I will get there shortly. But as you can see, there's a lot of gluten developed in this dough. When I press it out, it instantly wants to pull back together. So just take your time and stretch out this dough. Now you don't want to do so many at once if you're not comfortable. If you're a bit slower, you can just do one at a time. But if you do have a lot of portioned out balls, I'd recommend covering them with plastic wrap so they don't dry out. The second this dough dries out, it'll almost be impossible to fold. I started off with only doing like 2 buns at a time, maybe even 1, and it would take me forever. Now, of course, I'm a bit more comfortable. I can do 6. There are people that do like 12 at once. It really depends on how comfortable you are with dough and making dim sum. And before I place my filling, I will just gently stretch them all out one more time. Great, so you have these nice round balls pressed flat. And the advantage of actually doing multiple at once is that you can put an even amount of filling in each. As you can see here, I can actually compare how much filling is in each bun. Versus if you do one at a time, it's a bit more difficult to be consistent. I'm just gonna gently put it in the center. One key thing, probably the most important rule, is do not get the edges wet. The second you get the edges wet, your bun will not seal, and you should probably just toss that dough. First time starting, probably just put like half the amount of filling that you think you can fit in there, because it'll be extremely challenging to close a very stuffed bun. There's no shame in practice. All right. So by the looks of it, they all have roughly the same amount of filling, and we can start to fold. You're gonna grab, stretch the left and right side, touch them together, touch, touch. Always stretching and pulling and never getting the outsides wet again. I can't stress that enough. You're gonna gently spin the dough and just tease it, just pinch it together like that, while slowly pulling dough from the outside, but not too much, or else you're gonna have exploded buns. Round it off, check the bottom, it's all sealed, and there's one bun. We'll do it again. Stretch out the left and right side, touch them, stretch, touch, touch, and then seal. You want to hold it and gently pinch them together. And again, this will not work if it's wet. Just give up if it's wet. Like seriously, just empty out the filling and start again. Do not waste time if the edges are wet. I won't stress it again, but that was a big mistake of mine. I really didn't want to waste the dough. And I would always get the edges wet, obviously. And I would just spend hours, like literally hours, folding buns because I kept getting the edges wet and I kept trying to save the dough. It's not worth it. It is definitely not worth it. And it'll make your life a lot easier if you just restart. Again, I just use one finger. I always have one wet finger just to stuff the filling inside the bun. And then this wet finger never touches the dough, if you can notice. We have one last bun. Stretch, touch, bring it all together, press it with the one wet finger, and then pinch. The key thing is I'm just gently squeezing the dough together. Not trying to pull too much dough from the sides because that is actually the barrier and that will protect all the filling when it's baking. Great, you have nice 6 Char Siu Baos. At this stage, we're gonna cover it with plastic wrap and let it proof again. So you have nice big buns. Now, if you wanted to make these in advance, like let's just say you're entertaining and having a lot of Char Siu Bao, you can actually cover this, put it in the fridge, and let it sit for a few hours to slow down the proofing process. But if you want to bake these right away, you can also put it somewhere warm and it'll proof in maybe like 30 minutes. All right, so you have some buns that have already been proofed. As you can see, they're nice and supple, soft, and quite a bit larger. It's more so getting the brioche to come to room temperature. Since the filling's extremely cold, you always want to let things rest, let things get warm, so the bun isn't very tight. Since there's so much butter in this dough, the second it's cold, it gets extremely hard and it won't bake properly. Right now, it's nice and soft, room temperature, and ready to be baked. So what we do at the restaurant, I think a lot of people, when they eat dim sum, they know of a bolo bao, or a pineapple bun topping. The nice yellow crusty top. Here's something similar. So this is a Mexican bun topping. It's essentially a mixture of oil, lard, butter, flour, sugar, and egg whites. Now this icing acts like a protective layer for the bun, but also adds this extremely important texture to it. It's not just gonna have a nice, soft, buttery bun and a nice, juicy, saucy inside. You're going to have this delicious, crispy, sweet exterior, which makes our CSB, or Char Siu Bao, extremely unique. So I'm just gonna pipe a nice little top, and as this bakes in the oven, all this icing is gonna melt over top and create this beautiful, thin, crispy, sweet crust. All right, so this will go in the oven at 325 with a nice convection fan. If you don't have convection, I wouldn't recommend baking the buns. You need that airflow to get that nice crispy exterior and to get an even bake. And this will go in for about 25 minutes. Let's go put these in the oven. All right, so there you have it, R&D's signature CSB. If you look at it, it's the perfect golden brown. You can hear that. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's just extremely crispy, thin exterior. Still held its shape, nice and round. And as you can see on the inside, once I tear through that crispy shell, oh yeah, you got that nice, flaky, buttery bun, still piping hot. Perfect diced pieces of barbecue pork, and then of course, that beautiful pork bun sauce. Just oozing out, barely holding together. When you sink your teeth into this, it's absolutely phenomenal. And there you have it. That's all it takes to make R&D's signature barbecue pork buns. It's CSB.
So Eric, thank you so much for showing us how to make your famous Char Siu Bao. I remember going to your grandfather's bakery when it was in the old Chinatown, and it was always so busy, could never find a table. It was a very small establishment. So I used to always take out, and of course would always order Char Siu Bao, but it was different from what you have showed us, because today you did a baked Char Siu Bao, but I was always used to the steamed Char Siu Bao, it was white fluffy bun on the outside. But when you were growing up, did your grandfather ever make Char Siu Bao for you at home?
That's a great question. He actually made the steamed Char Siu Bao for me at home a few times, but it would never be too often, since I'm sure, as you saw from the video, it is a lot of work. Folding it, even making the steamed dough, as well as buying, filling, dicing up, and making a small batch of the sauce. For a restaurant, it's different, since we sell it every day. We can make a large amount, but my grandfather would always say, "Wow, ho ma fan," or just like very troublesome to make dim sum for us. So like there'd be a few dim sum that he would obviously make that he could freeze. So like the siu mai, for example, he could make a big batch and then we could have it. And he'd always make lo mai gai, which is like a lotus, like a rice dumpling that's wrapped with a lotus leaf. He would make that because the prep is easy, and yeah, it's just a lot of work making Char Siu Bao at home, but he would always make dim sum and try and bring the restaurant experience in our home for sure.
Well, you gave us a lot of really great tips on how, especially how to make Char Siu Bao, but especially the part about putting the pork filling inside the dough and really not making sure it doesn't get wet. And you make it look so easy, but you said it took you a while to master this. And I can imagine like your grandfather looking over your shoulder and making sure you're doing things right. So how much did he inspire you to do this Chinese cooking and pursue your dream of opening a restaurant?
I would say my grandfather was a huge inspiration for me, just because when I wanted to pursue cooking as a career, before MasterChef, obviously, I was like, well, Grandpa did it. Why couldn't I do it? So like, there wouldn't have been that initial thought if he had never owned his own restaurant, if he wasn't so talented, if he didn't like make this incredible food growing up. So he really opened my doors to authentic Asian cuisine, and he was self-taught, which was the most impressive thing. That was a great foundation for me, because a lot of people are like, oh, you didn't even go to culinary school. Like, then you have to like stop going to school, as well as join culinary school, and then go work in restaurants. It'll be forever until you own your own restaurant. My grandpa did it, and he did it self-taught, which was the most impressive thing. So I would say he was a huge inspiration.
Yeah, his place was so popular. There were lineups that would, to go into into his restaurant there. So I have really good memories of it. So, and we all have your recipe now, and I think I will try to make it myself at home, but I might be calling you for some tips, more tips than that. But anyhow, thank you very, very much for sharing your recipe with us. So this brings us to the end of our program, and I would now like to pass things back to Chris from the Gibson House Museum to make closing remarks.
I would like to thank our moderator, Wallace Wong, for leading this dynamic discussion about Chinese food diversity and authenticity. Thank you to our speakers, Ann Hui and Chen, for sharing their personal experiences and knowledge with us. Lastly, thanks to Chef Chong for the cooking demonstration. I can't wait to try it myself. I'd like to remind our audience that Gibson House is located near the intersection of Yonge Street and Shepherd Avenue East, just north of Mill Lastman Square. Gibson House Museum was honored to host such a wonderful event. It is especially meaningful as our garden and historic kitchen spaces bring people together across cultures and around food. Our year-round food history programming at Gibson House Museum has created meaningful, shared food experiences, and we are looking forward to welcoming you to the museum. Also, please be sure to check out the other episodes in the Chinese food series. All the episodes are posted on the city's YouTube channel. Thank you.